Fender continued selling the Telecaster, but had been developing something far more complex. From 1951 to 1953, Leo Fender toyed around with various experiments, such as a 7-pole pickup to balance out and dampen sounds between strings to get that quote-unquote dinka-dinka sound. He never ended up using it for good reason, as the Fender sound that everybody knows and loves now is based on sharpness and brightness. But when Gibson released the high-end Les Paul, Fender responded with the Stratocaster. The most recognizable guitar in history, this instrument was a marked step up for Fender and the world. It had not 2, but 3 pickups. The first guitar to do this. It also had 2 tone controls, just like the Gibson Les Paul. Fender also decided that the Telecaster's square edges could be rounded off, since it didn't have an internal sound chamber. Leo claims that the Telecaster, quote-unquote, always dug into my ribs. The Stratocaster's greatest innovation, however, was its bridge. With the help of Leo's former business partner, Doc Kaufman, and his contemporary Paul Bigsby, you might have heard of him, the internal spring-based vibrato system had increased tuning stability without compromising tone. It also promoted sustain, player comfort, and ease of use. The strings locked to what they called an inertia block to ensure sustain. The Strat's whammy bar was actually so effectively over-designed that it proved capable of far more than its designer imagined. Leo originally envisioned it to only allow slight pitch changes, but his design actually enabled a pitch span of up to 3.5 steps or more. Jimi Hendrix would later abuse this to make his dive bomb sounds. The Strat was also the first guitar to allow each string height to be individually adjusted. The pickup pulls were staggered height and effectively addressed the varying output across all 6 strings. The Strat was also the first guitar to feature a slanted input jack. The pickguard's main purpose was actually to allow the pickups, controls, and wirings to be dropped in place and screwed right on, not necessarily to protect the guitar from pick scratches, because nobody really cares. Wear and tear looks cool. The final prototype was shown to the public in spring of 1954, 4 years after the Telecaster and 2 years after the Gibson Les Paul. The first full-scale production run began in October of 1954. The original price tag was $249.50, or $2,356.40 in 2018, and it did not perform well at all. Professional musicians saw it as a gimmicky contraption. For the next 3 years, Leo Fender continued revising and improving the Strat until 1957, when it was basically perfected and has remained largely unchanged ever since. With a number of enhancements, the Strat had found its way into several acclaimed hands, but many consumers still hadn't seen one. That is, until a Texas rock and roll trio appeared on the Ed Sullivan Show on Sunday, December 1st, 1957. They charged through 2 songs, Peggy Sue and That'll Be the Day That I Die. Can you figure out the bands? They were led by a 21-year-old, thick black frame glasses wearing, Stratocaster wielding frontman. That same frontman died in a plane crash 2 years later on February 3rd, 1959, which was deemed the day that music died. Can you guess the band? Buddy Holly and the Crickets. Ike Turner, Pee Wee Crayton, Richie Valens, and Carl Perkins also helped spread the Strat. Across the Atlantic, however, post-World War II trade ban on U.S. goods made getting a Fender impossible for British guitarists in the late 50s. This was especially disappointing to a young London guitarist, Brian Rankin, who went by the stage name Hank Marvin, and had just joined singer Cliff Richard's band, armed with a cheap Japanese electric guitar. Marvin had seen Buddy Holly holding a Stratocaster on the cover of the 1957 album The Chirping Crickets, and he mistakenly thought it was the same model that James Burton played on Ricky Nelson's records. Trade ban or not, Richard offered to get Marvin a Stratocaster, an opportunity the guitarist jumped at, and in early 1959, a brand new Fiesta Red Strat with gold hardware somehow arrived in London. It was the UK's first ever Strat, and with it, Marvin went on to become Britain's first full-fledged acknowledged guitar hero. By 1958, Fender also released the Jazzmaster, which was considered the second incarnation Strat. It brought a handful of developments, most notably a two-piece neck and a rosewood fretboard. In late 1959, kids that would skyrocket the Strat into eternal stardom were owning their craft. In the UK, three 14-year-olds, Pete Townsend, Eric Clapton, and Ritchie Blackmore, a 15-year-old named Jeff Beck, and a 13-year-old named David Gilmour. You ever heard of him? In the US, a flamboyant 23-year-old named Buddy Guy, a 22-year-old Californian who went by the name of Dick Dale, and a 5-year-old Stevie Ray Vaughan, whose hands were barely big enough to fit around the neck. Jimi Hendrix turned 17 that November. He had just bought his first guitar the year before for $5. He paid for it himself, and he practiced constantly. Little did they or Leo Fender know that these 9 young individuals would be the greatest Stratocaster ambassadors of all time. The Strat, to this day, is the most successful guitar of all time, and most guitars built after the mid-1960s were based on it or at least included many of the innovations that it trailblazed.